Distinguished delegates, I would like to start with today's session. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to resume this special virtual session of a subsidiary body of implementation. I would like to thank you for participation yesterday and for joining us again today. Today, we will continue with our session from yesterday and our consideration of review reports. I am aware that a number of parties and observers have submitted over the course of yesterday and today statements through the CBD email for both of today's sessions. I would like to remind parties and observers of the agreed procedure for this trial, testing of a party-led review process through an open-ended forum. Through a notification issued on August the 14th, parties were invited to examine review reports and submit any questions that they would like to be addressed during the open-ended forum to the Secretariat by the 10th of September, stating clearly for which party or parties they are intended. As indicated in the notification, the 5 presenting countries have selected questions from those submitted from other parties by the deadline of 10th of September to respond during this session. I will therefore not be opening the floor for any more statements or interventions at the end of the session. Any questions that the Secretariat has received will be forwarded to a party under review with a request to get in touch bilaterally. The experiences and lessons learned from this trial phase will be discussed during SBI-3 during Agenda Item 9, including modalities and procedures for future SBI forums. The Secretariat will initiate an online survey shortly after the end of this session to gather views on the experience from this trial forum. I would also like to remind you that yesterday I had indicated that I will start the interventions during the resource mobilization item with regional statements. And if you have not done so yet, please email your regional statements immediately to statements@cbd.int, identifying clearly which country will speak for the region. Time permitting, I will open the floor to parties and observers. The statements received for the resource mobilization session will be posted on the meeting site. Before we proceed with further presentations by the parties, I would like to invite the Secretariat to give us some information on the use of a meeting platform. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. If you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. It will turn yellow and your status will show hand raised. Please do not press the button twice, as this will put you at the end of the queue. We will be notified of your request in our queue system. The Chair will invite you to speak when it is your turn. You will see on your status bar, microphone open, and your speak button will flash in blue. Press the speak button. It will turn red to live, which will turn on your camera and microphone automatically. Wait for 2 seconds, then proceed with your intervention. You may wish to ask the audience if you can be heard easily. When you are finished, please press the speak button again to turn off your live broadcast. Please speak slowly so that the interpreters are easily able to follow your statements. We would also like to remind parties that are making regional statements to forward these statements to the statements@cbd.int email as soon as possible and in advance of taking the floor, and preferably before the start of a session. All other statements should also be emailed to statements@cbd.int. We would like to remind participants that the chat box is for brief comments, and therefore we remind you to keep your remarks there brief. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Before we start, I would like to remind the parties under review that you have 15 minutes with which to make your presentation, and we will have 15 minutes for a question and answer afterwards. I would now like to give the floor to the first party today. I would like to give the floor to Finland to make a presentation. Finland, if you please raise your hand. Finland, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Good. Dear colleagues, good afternoon from Oulu in the north of Finland. And here we go. In what follows, I will be taking you through a review of the implementation of the National Strategy and Action Plan in Finland. Joining me is Senior Ministerial Advisor Marina von Sorry. And to begin with, we are quite lucky in terms of just having finalized and published an impact assessment on the present NBSAP in Finland. It was published 3 weeks ago, and it was a joint project between my institution, the Finnish Environment Institute, and Natural Resources Institute Finland. And I'll first give you 2 slides as a background to the biodiversity policies in Finland. First, in terms of a timeline. We started back in 95, 25 years ago, started to think how to implement the CBD in Finland and came up with the first action plan in 97. And what's important in terms of this presentation, we did the first evaluation of the action plan we had at that time in 2005, and what I'm now presenting you is based on those experiences and on the indicators we started to develop at that stage. Another feature of biodiversity policies in Finland is that we've had a broad-based national biodiversity working group convened in Finland since the very beginning, since 1996. It was broad-based from the beginning, but it has become even broader in recent years. And here you can see a list of the institutions involved. So there are pretty much all the ministries of the government. And then you have a number of state authorities, research institutes. You have Sami Parliament representing the indigenous peoples. You have the academy, local governments, representatives of the business sector, of agriculture producers and forest owners, NGOs, and a youth organization. And I think this has been one of the strong features of the Finnish policy. So moving on to the questions that countries were asked to present or answer. How has the convention and strategic plan been implemented in Finland? So first of all, we have 5 goals and 20 national targets that are much in line with the global strategic plan and IT targets. The IT targets have just slightly been modified to account for national circumstances, but they are more than 90% the same. And to put these into practice, we have a national action plan consisting of 105 actions that cover 24 themes that you can see here. So we have quite a lot of cross-cutting issues in the beginning, and then actions related to habitats, also to indigenous peoples, genetic diversity, international issues, and so on. And if you wish to have a closer look at the actions, you can find them at that address given below. There was also a question regarding legislative action. Well, some laws that have an impact on biodiversity have been drafted or revised in recent years. These relate to environmental protection, alien species, sustainable forestry, fishing, and environmental impact assessment. But then the two arguably most important laws in terms of biodiversity, the Nature Conservation Act and Land Use and Building Act, are currently under revision and will be ready, I think, quite soon. So the questions our research group was asked to answer are quite broad-ranging, ranging from the state and trends and drivers and pressures to biodiversity, and the overall success of the NBSAP, or actually as the action plan to implement the strategy. But then the fourth question is especially important in Finland. How has the division of responsibilities among ministries worked out? And as a short answer, it has actually worked out quite well. And also questions relating to cross-cutting measures such as communication, financial steering, and so on, and also on the role of the private and third sectors, as well as production and consumption. And the seventh question was a general how well as the NBSAP fulfills its role as the central means of implementing the CBD nationally. So here you can see an example of what we did in practice. So we looked at all of the 105 actions, and as we were just talking about legislation, so here's an example of the theme of legislation. So in the first column on the left-hand side, you can see implementation. So this is taken straight from the sixth national report. But then we tried to move on to look at things in more detail. So we looked at the trend. So if we had actions related to biodiversity, like having a straight impact, so then we looked at the trend in biodiversity. But in this case, as we have cross-cutting measures, so we looked at the development of legislation. And in this case, if you look at the action number 11, there were conflicting trend with some laws becoming more biodiversity friendly and some not so. So the trend was deemed stable. Then we looked at the financial allocation as a sum total of the NBSAP period. We looked at the target in terms of the share of the total number of species in Finland affected, also in terms of the share of the total area Finland affected, and the indirect impact on the population as a share of the total number of Finns. And for the first four columns, we had quite a lot of data to base our evaluation on, but when we move on to impact and potential, it was more of an expert opinion of the research group. So what we can say in summary of the trends, just over half of the actions had a positive or resulted in a positive trend. So of course, in the future, we have to make sure that the share is larger. This is taken from the report that you can find online, so I will just pick up on 2 points. The most pronounced improving trends were often observed in actions with a low level of ambition. But then on the other hand, a slightly improving trend was often observed in actions which had been partially implemented, which implementation started late, or dealt with new ways of operation. So I think there's actually an encouraging message here in the sense that we have several actions which with enough investment in the future could yield in notable results. In terms of technical financial resources, I will pick up on 2 points. There were 5 actions which had simultaneously high level of financial allocation, moderate impact over the present NPSAP period, and a great potential in the future. These include EU programs, Metsä Forest Biodiversity Program, nature management in state-owned commercial forests, the management of high nature value farmland, and the Baltic Sea Action Plan. So in these cases, resources had been successfully invested in actions that can yield considerable results.
Yes, Finland, I will just remind you that you have 5 minutes left now. Thank you.
Thank you. And there are also actions where we have gotten good results with only small financial investments. And examples include communication, education, and cooperation with the business sector. So is there any need of adjustment? Well, yes, most of the actions only had a low impact on the present NPSAP period, but then on the other hand, there's a lot more potential in future. So what's written in red at the end is that in the next NPSAP, actions need to be smart, i.e. follow the SMART principles, need to be fewer. 105 actions is too much to really monitor well and in real time. They should aim for concrete outcomes and be accompanied by indicators on implementation trends and resources, as we have tried to do in this evaluation. So, moving on to the last question, what are the unresolved challenges in implementation? Here's a quote from a media press release that we gave out in May. So we think that in this decade, Finland has the first realistic measure to reverse the trend of biodiversity. This is based on the fact that over the past 5 years, we have developed many means of operating and many networks. So we know what to do and how to do. Halting the loss of biodiversity requires a strong commitment from the whole society and an ecological transition that permeates all of its functions. And by ecological transition, we've referred to what has been referred to in international literature as transformational change, systemic change, and so on, basically meaning that we have to take biodiversity into account in all decision making and turn from increasing or continuing pressures to a net positive impact on nature. So by far the largest unresolved challenges are commitment, resources, and accountability. But on a more positive note, there has been recently an increasing political and economic interest in the safeguarding of biodiversity in Finland, which holds great promise. And the review has received considerable attention in the media, and its main results have already been presented to a number of politicians. Here's an example from the largest newspaper in Finland, and its editorial, which was basically pretty much exactly what we tried to say in our review. So this was a great accomplishment for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Finland. I would now like to open the floor for questions by representatives of parties. We will have a question from Morocco. Morocco, please raise your hand. Morocco, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The Moroccan delegation congratulates Finland for the progress made on implementing its strategy. My question is the next. Noting that forest spaces are assessed as seriously threatened, could you please share measures that the forest sector has been taking to address biodiversity issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Morocco. I understand that Finland would like to respond to this question first. So Finland, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's a very relevant question since forestry is a big issue in Finland. It's both a big issue in terms of it's important for the economy and employment and as a pressure on biodiversity. Roughly 90% of the forest area is in commercial use in Finland, and most of it is being used quite intensively, although it is semi-natural in character, so we don't have any plantations of exotic species, for example. And commercial forestry is the single biggest threat to species in Finland. There have been two types of measures in relation to forest, those aiming at expanding the network of protected areas and those aimed at transforming forestry operations. So in terms of protection, the main measure has been the Metso Forest Biodiversity Program, with a specific focus on the southern half of the country where we should do a lot more protection. The program has been successful, especially in creating more positive attitudes towards protection. Its overall goal of protecting approximately 100,000 hectares of forest by 2025 is quite meager. However, this amounts to approximately 0.5 of the total forest area. Well, measures within commercial forest management include measures aimed at decreasing the volume of deadwood and of structural heterogeneity, and those aim at sparing habitats that are especially rich in biodiversity. So in practice, these measures include forest certification with criteria for living retention trees and buffer zones, among others, applying continuous growth forestry, and creating and improving information systems that allow for the safeguarding of threatened species and habitats, for example. So much work has been done, for example, to utilize geospatial information so that the forestry operators in the field would know what to do and what not to do and where. Thank you.
Thank you, Finland. We now have a question from Georgia. Georgia, if you raised your hand. Georgia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Considering that Finland is probably one of the best cases of synergies implementation, I wonder how they tried during the development of the MBSAPs and later in process of implementation to achieve synergies with other biodiversity-related conventions, and what were the lessons learned from this process. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Georgia. And we also have a question from Egypt. Egypt, if you can raise your hand. Egypt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to say I'm very, very pleased with the excellent presentation that already given to us by Finland, which is very, very encouraging. Having said that, I understand that the adjustment of MBSAP, it is clear that you are prepared for preparing proposals for the extent for the next MBSAP. My question is, to what extent that your country will take into consideration or account the goals and targets of the post-2020 GBF when revising your MBSAP? Thank you.
Thank you, Egypt. And before I give the floor to Finland for the response, I will once again remind parties that unfortunately I cannot give the floor to more questions. As I explained in the beginning, only those questions that have been sent in beforehand, according to the modalities already decided, could be responded during this session. So I hope you understand that. I'm sorry for that. But now I would like to give the floor to Finland for their response. Finland, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the questions, both by Egypt and by Georgia. I will start by answering Egypt's question first, and then I will go on to Georgia's question on synergies. As you have heard, the national review process has been extremely important for our national work and priority setting, and this is already the second time we have done this assessment. And these kinds of reviews are important both for measuring the efficiency and effectiveness of implementation, but also for the priority setting in the future. The lessons learned from the 2 rounds of review and impact assessment are positive and have been reported to the government and publicly, and there has been good coverage in the media, as Ari-Pekka already mentioned previously. The proposals for future actions will be pulled together by researchers as explained today. They will be considered and be part of the post-2020 national work. But this is not the only source of information. We will transfer all relevant information to the National Biodiversity Working Group, which include all ministries and relevant stakeholders, the IPLCs, academia, and others, which will be in charge of drawing up and revise the new NBSAP. The new National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan for Finland will be ready in 2021, including, of course, the Global Biodiversity Framework and its goals and targets as an essential part of this work, and also the EU Biodiversity Strategy. Because of the review and the assessment we have been doing, we know where we need to do more and where to put our resources in light of the IG biodiversity targets and for future successful outcomes. And to Georgia on synergies. We have been involving in our national planning and in the coordination mechanism, the other biodiversity-related MEAs, and also we have an active dialogue with the chemical conventions nowadays. And I'm chairing the International Biodiversity Group, which includes all national focal points, and we meet regularly through this group, and we are also following actively the other conventions, conference of the parties and their preparations, including the IPBES work and assessments. Finland is and has been advocating and promoting this on national level, and we believe in synergies, in cooperation and integration and exchange of information on all levels, on both national, regional and global, and also in the work for UNEP, UNDP, FAO, GEF, and the UN system, including the Rio Conventions. This is important for many reasons, both for effectively using our existing resources, but it's also important in our regard for good governance, for ownership, and for mainstream biodiversity into different sectors of our society. Additionally, the relationship between the SDGs and biodiversity is important for our common goals in Finland, including the work on indicators, reporting, review, and accountability. And we believe that involvement of all interested stakeholders and commitments are key for successful implementation and ownership in this process. And I also want to underline that for mainstreaming and for synergies, awareness raising, communication is key, and this awareness raising and media attention has helped us also in the work of synergies. And I think this is also a very good asset, and we need to continue through our national communication group that is chaired by the Ministry of Environment, which includes all relevant communication people, including our public broadcast system in Finland. So thank you very much for your attention, and hope this reflects the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Finland. May I congratulate you of being among the first parties to be reviewed. On behalf of all parties, I wish to thank you for your willingness to participate in this process, which will certainly be of the benefit of the convention process. So many thanks. I would now like to give the floor to Guyana to make a presentation. Guyana, could you please raise your hand? Guyana? Guyana, you have the floor.
I would just like to thank the CBD for this opportunity for us to showcase our implementation status so far. So I'm from the Guyana Environmental Protection Agency, the national focal point for the CBD, and I have with me my colleague from the Department of Environment. So let's just go into the, sorry. Can you see the screen?
Not yet.
Okay, just give me a second, please. Because I just not seem to get it.
Maybe you can start your presentation without sharing your screen.
Okay, all right, so I'll just go ahead.
Thank you.
Okay, so just to give some background to our process with CBD so far, we have signed on in 1992 and ratified in 1994. We also acceded to the Cartagena Protocol in 2008 and the Nagoya Protocol in 2014. We submitted the third, fourth, and fifth, and most recent 6th national report. We also prepared the NBAP 1, NBAP 2, and the most recent was our NBSAP 2011 to 2020. We also submitted the interim national report on ABS, third, second, and fourth national report to the Cartagena Protocol. So for our NBSAP, for this purpose, this review was mostly derived from our 6th national report. The strategic plan that we developed in 2011 and to 2020 was linked. We developed 31 national targets linked to 13 IG biodiversity targets. From those targets, we came up with 9 strategic objectives, The first strategic objective being to improve the status of biodiversity by conveying ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity, and by restoring biodiversity and ecosystem services in degraded areas. For this objective, we linked two national targets to it. The first one being to protect 17% terrestrial area for in situ conservation, and also to effectively manage it and be financially sustainable by 2020. The second target under that objective was to reduce biodiversity loss. So the measures that we had in place to achieve this objective, we committed almost 2 million hectares to achieve this 70% protected areas by 2020. This is via the nationally determined commitments. We also developed legislation. So we had the Protected Areas Act passed in 2011, which established our protected areas system. We also developed a policy on sea defense and intercoastal zone management, and that is still in the drafting stages. Moving on to strategic objective, well, continuing on the same one, we also had target 3, which was to have in place a protected areas trust fund and ensure that the protected areas system is sustainably financed. Coming out from this under the Protected Areas Act, this kind of ensured that the trust was also established via the Act. For target 4, by 2050, we should at least restore 3 mined out sites. So far, what we were able to accomplish was to draft national land use policy, and also we had a national reclamation project that contributes to restoring these mined out sites as well. So far, we were able to start the restoration of almost 20 hectares of previously mined sites. Moving on to target 5, we were to develop a germplasm facility, a gene bank, in accordance with FAO. So far, the only progress we achieved with that was to develop a policy within the Ministry of Agriculture, which highlight the importance of having this gene bank in place. Moving on to strategic objective 2, which was to promote the conservation, sustainable use, and value of biodiversity into key productive sectors for growth, expansion, and diversification of the economy. So on this objective, we have several other targets, which came from the national targets we developed. So target 6, we have by 2020, we should have a REDD+ framework in place and functioning. And by 2016, a national conflict resolution strategy for REDD+ developed and functional. So the measures took here was we developed the national document, the Green State Development Strategy. This is continue on from a previous document that kind of laid the foundation for this, the Low Carbon Development Strategy. Basically what this document seeks to do is to establish Ghana into a green state, and in line with the REDD+ program, and also to strengthen the forestry sector as well. Target 8, another one on objective 2, by 2020, biodiversity concerns are integrated into hinterland ecosystem development plans and strategies. The policy here, we developed, policy was developed, the National Tourism Policy from 2011 to 2025, which is to contribute to growth to GDP by supporting sustainable development. Target 9, by 2016, GEF supported project to mainstream biodiversity into the mining sector. We had 2 GEF projects so far, the final one being, or the last one being implemented right now. Target 10, guidelines for responsible recreational fishing practices and ornamental collection. Again, this is tied in with the policy that I mentioned earlier from the Ministry of Agriculture. Moving on to strategic objective 3, which is to expand and improve awareness, appreciation, and communication on biodiversity and ecosystem. We have here target 1 and national target 11 from the national targets, the achievement of the intended input of the full implementation for the communication strategy of the NBSAP. In our NBSAP, the measure there, we had developed a communication strategy, but so far it hasn't been implemented properly because some of it was kind of unorganized and the impact was fragmented. Target 11 by 2020, coastal wetlands, mountain, highlands, and region rainforest ecosystem features a zoological park. The measure there was the implementation of a protected areas policy via their strategic plan 2016 to 2020, which would outline improvement of the commission itself and also the revitalization of our zoological parks. We're moving on to strategic objective 4, improve national implementation, monitoring, and reporting for MEAs and other bilateral agreements. So basically target 13, 14, and 15 from our national targets was to have prepared our 5th national report, complete our NBSAP, and develop indicators. We benefited from a project from Jeff, implemented by UNEP to prepare the NBSAP and 5th national report. Also, we established the MEA committee at the national level, and also we developed. So this project was developed, and we were able to benefit in achieving these targets. Moving on to strategic objective 5, which is to create stronger and wider national, regional, and international partnerships that contribute to achieving the goal and objectives of the plan. This objective included target 18 and target 19. Target 18 means to finalize our access and benefit sharing regulations. Again, we were able to accomplish this via another Jeff project, which was implemented in the Caribbean region. And the outcome was that we were able to finalize our ABS regulations. Target 19 by 2016, our research interface developed with the University of Guyana, Conservation International, and WWF. Unfortunately, this target was abandoned because it kind of overlapped with another target, which I will mention. Moving on to strategic objective 7, which is to improve substantially biodiversity monitoring at the national level and within key productive sectors. Under this target, which we have national targets 23 and 24. By 2020, we should have in place the EU FLEG. This is the Forest Law Enforcement, Government and Trade program, and also to have a voluntary partnership agreement in place. We were able to accomplish just the VPA. Again, it was just initial, nothing further to this effect. Target 24, to have a monitoring, reporting, and verification system within our forestry sector fully functioning. Through a bilateral agreement with Norway and Guyana, we were able to have this system up in place, and Guyana could realize funds up to 250 million based on how we're able to have a stand in forest and practice sustainable forest management. We also developed...
Guyana, sorry, interrupt. 3 minutes left.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, and this was backed by legislation. Strategic objective 8 was basically to have our knowledge base and capacity for management sustainable use of biodiversity. We kind of like have our clearinghouse mechanism now developed. It just needs to be populated now, and also so that was target 8, and target 9 was to have a resource mobilization plan in place. We do have a plan, but it's at the moment lacking. So that's the end of our strategic objectives, which correspond to the 31 national objectives derived from the 13 Aichi biodiversity targets. For technical and financial support, well, most of it, as you would have heard, came from the Global Environmental Fund. We're able to benefit from funding from KFW as well and IDB. Technical support came from UNEP, UNDP, IUC, and of course the Secretariat. Throughout the implementation of this plan, well, I mentioned resources were made available to us. However, they kind of needed to be prioritized, because what we found happening was that we had an uneven implementation of the plan. Some areas received more focus than the others, and others were kind of left by the wayside. Well, we also recognized that the NBSAP, it was severely lacking the formulation of the national targets, or some were inconsistent with recognized methodologies. For instance, this was very evident in the absence of corresponding indicators, which lacked smartness. The principles of that weren't adequately implemented during the development of the document. We also recognize the lack of an effective framework for monitoring, and as such, the NBSAP will need to be revised and also to take into account consideration for the post-2020 framework. Unresolved challenges, the challenges encountered with the implementation remain mostly unresolved around limited funding, and lack of capacity continues to plague its implementation. And also awareness, both at political and public levels, still pose a challenge as the uptake has been slowful. So I thank you very much. I'm very sorry you couldn't have seen the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guyana. I will now open the floor for questions by representatives of the parties. We now have a question from Uganda. Uganda, can you please raise your hand? Uganda? Uganda, you have the floor. Uganda, please go ahead. Uganda, please, you can go ahead.
Hello? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Guyana, for your presentation. I have just one question. It's about what are some of the factors and measures that supported your achievement of target 1 and 2? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Uganda. We also have a question from Canada. Canada, please raise your hand. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Guyana, for your presentation. Our question is, has the review report been an effective tool in communicating domestic progress towards national biodiversity targets? And as a follow-up to that question, what has the review report's value added been in comparison to the 6th national report? Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. And we also have a question from Sweden. Sweden, please raise your hand. Sweden, you have the floor.
A lot. Can you hear me? Thanks a lot to Guyana for this really interesting presentation. Sorry that we couldn't see it. Our question would be, could you maybe further elaborate on the actions described in your report, and what the level of progress is to achieve your national goals? Thank you.
Thank you, Sweden. And thank you for these questions. I would now like to give the floor back to Guyana for their response. Guyana, if you please raise your hand. Guyana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Uganda, Sweden, and Canada for your questions. We will try our best to provide a response. So for the question from Uganda, looking at what other measures supported achievement of targets 1 and 2, in setting those targets, what we already had in place was a national protected area system. Prior to the development of those targets, we had the legislative and institutional frameworks already set up. We also had a policy directive looking at rescinding of forest concessions that would have otherwise resulted in biodiversity loss. We would have already had ongoing work looking at the mainstreaming of biodiversity in the mining sector to realize the uptake of biodiversity considerations, looking at best practices, awareness of legislation, etc. For the questions from Canada, looking at how the review report, or has the review report been an effective tool in communicating domestic progress? So for us, other than the 6NR, this report is the only other reporting report that was prepared since the first iteration, specifically for this open-ended forum. So at this point in time, it hasn't been adopted nationally as a tool. However, we do see the potential usefulness of this report in communicating progress nationally. Looking at what value it may have added in comparison to the 6th National Report, what we found so far is that it's a public-friendly document compared to the 6NR. We see it serving as a summary for policymakers, and it provides us internally an opportunity to measure progress as well. For the questions from Sweden, looking at what other issues would have been covered by, what other IT targets were covered. What is important to note is that in the development of our NBSAP, it was done through stakeholder consultation. The IT targets and national targets that were selected and prioritized is based on stakeholder feedback and recommendation. However, in implementing the NBSAP, we recognize there were other targets that were applicable to us to some extent, and to some extent work is being done to implement those other targets. But however, what we found is that we were unable to really assess progress due to lack of available data and information. And the final question, elaborate on how the action is described in the review report would have contributed to achievement of national targets, and looking at the level of progress. Our review report did not contain actions, but rather a snapshot of the level of progress on implementation of the 2011-2020 Biodiversity Plan. What is important to note, apart from the 6NR, is the first iteration of another reporting report. And this is the first for us since the development of the NBSAP. And the final report being, or the previous report being the 6NR. So the progress, the level of progress right now is mixed. I hope these responses address the questions that were asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Guyana, for your response. And I will just I'm sorry about your presentation, but I can inform all that all presentations will be put online after the meeting, so you can also study the presentation by Guyana online afterwards. So many thanks, Guyana. May I congratulate you on being among the first parties to be reviewed. On behalf of all parties, I wish to thank you for your willingness to participate in this voluntary review, which will certainly be of a benefit to the convention process. I would like to thank all of the speakers for excellent presentations. They have given us many valuable insights and perspectives to consider as we move ahead. And as I said, that all presentations will also be published online. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of a testing of a party-led review process through an open-ended forum. As I have informed you already, after these sessions, the Secretariat will follow up with an online survey to collect additional feedback and insights, which will be presented and discussed during SBI-3 in accordance with Decision 14/29. I invite all parties to actively contribute to this process. Your feedback and insights on the trial phase of the open-ended forum will be presented to the SBI during Agenda Item 9 on review mechanism, which is also expected to consider other options and elements to enhance review mechanism. This part of a special session is now completed. We will now turn to our next item. So, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let us now turn to the next item of our special session on resource mobilization. I would like to remind participants that this session intends to provide information and clarification on the work done by the CBD panel of experts and to promote common understanding of the progress made in resource mobilization, of the lessons learned, the challenges ahead, and proposals on the ways and means to address these challenges. I wish to invite participants to raise questions and intervene in this spirit. You will recall that in Decision 14/22, the Conference of the Parties affirmed that resource mobilization would be an integral part of a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. COP14 requested the Executive Secretary to contract a panel of experts to undertake preparatory work on resource mobilization on several aspects related to the development of the resource mobilization component in order to inform the work of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and the Conference of the Parties. We have a panel with us today to hear about their work. I am pleased to extend a warm welcome to the panel, consisting of Ms. Tracy Cummings from the Republic of South Africa, Mr. Jascha Pfefferholz from EcoHealth Alliance, and Mr. Jeremy Eppel of United Kingdom. After the presentation by the experts, we will hear from the Secretariat on how the work of the panel was reflected in a main document before us and the draft recommendation contained therein. We will then provide an opportunity for questions and answers on the presentations after inviting a statement from the Secretariat of the Global Environmental Facility. And before we move to the presentation by the experts, I will now pass the floor to the Secretariat to give us some housekeeping information and to provide an overview of the documentation before us. Secretariat, please raise your hand. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear delegates, let me first give you some housekeeping information. This session will be recorded and made available on the Secretariat's website. After all presentation, the Chair will open the discussion and take 6 questions from regions. The Chair will then give the floor to the presenters to respond and take other questions if time allows. We invite you to raise questions for clarification and explanation on the work of the panel of experts or the document chapeau. In addition, parties and observers are invited to submit questions and comments through the chat box, and if time allows, the presenters will answer to some of them and otherwise will provide answers in writing after the meeting. 4 pre-session documents and 2 complementing information documents have been made available for SBI-3. Document CBD SBI/3/5 is the chapeau document, which provides the draft recommendation and will be further explained by my colleague Marcus Lehmann in a moment. Then, 3 addenda documents provide the work of the expert panel, responding to the tasks given to them in paragraph 15 of Decision 1422, namely CBD SBI-3/5/1 provides a synthesis of the evaluation and review of the existing strategy for resource mobilization and Aichi Biodiversity Target 20, responding to subparagraph 15A and B of Decision 14/22. The full evaluation is made available as an information document, INF2, and it will be presented in a moment by Mr. Jeremy Apple. The document CBD SBI/3/5/2 provides the preliminary report on estimating the resources needed for implementing the post-2020 framework, responding to subparagraph 15C of Decision 14/22. Supplementary technical information is provided in an accompanying information document, INF/5. This report is characterized as being preliminary because some relevant analyses were still underway by the time of its finalization, such as the needs assessment for the AIDS replenishment of the CHEF Trust Fund, requested by Decision 14/23. The final report will be provided by to the Conference of the Parties as its 15th meeting. It will be presented in a moment also by Mr. Jascha Pfefferholz. And finally, the document CBD SBI-3/5/3 provides the contribution of the panel of experts to the draft resource mobilization component as per subparagraph 15D of Decision 14/22. It will be presented by Mrs. Tracy Cummings. In the remaining subparagraph 15A to H of Decision 14/22, the expert panel was to explore and consider various specific aspects of resource mobilization. In the report referred to above, these aspects were considered in a cross-cutting manner. All these documents are available and accessible from the CBD website at the following address: www.cbd.int/meetings/SBI-3. You will also find a synthesis of these reports on the CBD website at the following address: www.cbd.int/conferences/substa24 SBI-3 prep, SBI-03 prep. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat, for this presentation. Before I invite the experts to do their presentation, I would like to ask those parties that has planned to make a statement on behalf of a regional group and have not informed the Secretariat yet, to please alert the Secretariat through the chat box. We know already that we will have a statement from the GROLAC region, the EU and its member state, and JASCANS. But if any more regional groups would like to do a statement, please alert the Secretariat through the chat box, so we can make sure that you will have the floor first. Thank you. I would now like to invite the panel of experts on resource mobilization to present their work. Mr. Apple, could you please raise your hand? You will have 7 minutes. Mr. Eppel, you have the floor.
Good evening to everybody. Very nice to be part of this virtual session. Sorry not to be seeing you all in person. I have a short presentation, so I would like to share my screen, which I will now attempt to do. Let's see if we can do that. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Is that visible?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Fine, I'll get started. So this is the first part of a triumvirate presentation by the three members of the panel. First of all by myself, secondly from my colleague Jascha Pfefferholz, and finally from my colleague Tracy Cumming. We are going to cover the three reports that the panel has produced. As you've mentioned, and as Odile has mentioned, we were asked under the decision from COP14 to prepare these three reports. The first, the one I will talk about, a review of experiences and evaluation of the current strategy for resource mobilization. The second report covers an estimation of the resources that Okay, let me put my mic higher up. Is that better? Can you hear me better, interpreters?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'll do my best to speak into the mic. And the third report, which Tracy will talk about, is looking at possible components of resource mobilization in the post-2020 framework. This work we have undertaken, and all of three of the reports are now available, was based, since October 2018, included a call for evidence based on notification, a range of expert meetings, various global and regional consultation workshops, including one in Berlin in January, and various other discussions. And the reports are all available at the website on SBI-3. I just want to check that everybody can hear okay. Can you just confirm? I can't see you because I'm looking at my slides.
Yes, we can hear.
Great, thank you. I'll carry on then. So I'm just going to have 2 or 3 slides reminding you indeed of the key findings from the first report, the evaluation and review. The essential conclusion we reached, and this was based on considerable discussions but also inputs from a whole range of parties and outside observers, is that the underlying structure was still essentially sound, but there were real questions about how operationally effective the strategy was, especially in developing countries, and serious challenges on implementation linked to capacity and a lack of priority for biodiversity, particularly outside of environment ministries. We also concluded that there's a very important read across to the mainstreaming discussion, to the AHU Biodiversity Target 3, which looks at harmful subsidies, and of course to access and benefit sharing, and that these had only been partially integrated into the strategy's overall goals. There were a range of other gaps and shortcomings in the original strategy, such as a failure to really address the needs of the opportunity for involving the private sector, and over-optimism about private sector investment so far. No real reference to the financial markets and the banking sector, which we think are very important. No real time-bound action plan for implementation. Too little emphasis on innovative financing, and perhaps not as much quality, comparable, transparent reporting methodologies. So all of those are issues that were of concern in the first one. Just very briefly want to remind you of a few key statistics that are relevant as we look ahead. Thinking about coming from the OECD's recent comprehensive overview of global biodiversity finance, the conclusion they reached is that there's somewhere between $78 and $91 billion a year being invested one way or another into biodiversity, but the lion's share of that, the vast majority, is actually from domestic sources in developed and developing countries, and that international public biodiversity finance flows in practice make up only somewhere between 3 and 12% of the total.
Sorry to interrupt again. Could you please slow down a little for the interpreters? It's easier to follow. Thank you.
I shall. I'm trying to juggle the content and the time, but I will slow down a little. Just to emphasise that international biodiversity finance makes up only a small proportion of the total flows. Domestic finance is the majority, and private sector expenditure is again only a small part. So these are areas that should not be underestimated or overemphasised. In other words, they aren't the total solution. Domestic is very important still. We looked also in the first report at the progress towards the targets that had been set at COP12 in Pyeongchang in 2014, the 5 key resource mobilization targets. The most difficult to conclude, as I recall, was that on doubling of international financial flows by 2015 and maintaining that level to 2020. In fact, it was achieved, and although a slight redress in 2016, that recovered and the doubling was maintained in 2017 and 2018. The second target was looking at inclusion of biodiversity in national plans by 2015. Progress there, I think we could say, was mixed, moderate. 68% of parties reported some inclusion, only 32% comprehensively. And reporting on domestic spending needs was much less satisfactory in terms of actual reporting achievements. Preparation of national plans and valuation by 2015, which was one of the quite significant targets from that package, only a quarter of reporting countries had elements of their financial plan, although 83% had managed to undertake some valuation of their domestic biodiversity resources. And it's difficult to detect trends going forward still on domestic financial resources, and it may be challenging to firmly assess by the end of this year, as relatively few parties have effectively established their needs gap and prepared national plans for biodiversity. So, what did that lead us to conclude at the end of the first report? And these issues are picked up in much more detail in the third report, which is our suggestions and recommendations for inclusion in the post-2020 framework. But we could already, by the end of the first report, looking back over the previous 10 years, conclude that attention was needed not only on generating additional resources, but importantly on redirecting and reducing the harmful use of resources, which the OECD study shows is very much more significant than directly applied resources that are positive for biodiversity. And thirdly, a third pillar, if you like, all resources need to be more effectively and efficiently used and accounted for. There's also real opportunities to enhance synergies with climate change and SDG finance. I think that's self-evident. And that mainstreaming of biodiversity across the public and private sectors and their spending plans is essential. That's been said for a very long time. We redouble our emphasis on that. How to achieve it, of course, is the challenge. And recognise it, and it's important too to recognise that domestic resources will remain crucial in all countries. We also really see the importance of integrating biodiversity comprehensively, not superficially, not greenwash, but comprehensively into the business and financial sectors. And of course, self-evidently, for governments to put their money where their mouth is, put their action where their words are, lead by example, and to create a strong enabling framework for others. But none of that will be as effective as it could be if there isn't serious attention to capacity building. So I'll stop there, and my colleagues will continue about other reports. I hope that's been within time and useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eppel. I now wish to invite Mr. Pfefferholz to present his report. If you please raise your hand. You also have 7 minutes. Mr. Pfefferholz, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Can you see me?
Not yet, but I can hear you.
Okay. I'll try to share my screen. and see if instead of can you see my screen now?
Yes, now I can see your screen. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So after Jeremy, I'm going to present the second report that provides information about the estimation of resources needs. Like Jeremy mentioned, in paragraph 15C of decision 1422, the conference of the parties tasked the panels of experts to estimate the resources from all sources needed for different scenarios of the implementation of the post-2020 framework, taking into account the needs assessment of the global environmental facility, as well as costs and benefits arising from the implementation of the post-2020 framework. Hopefully, I'm going to try to go slow. Like you can let me know if it's too fast, just because of the sake of the 7 minutes that we have. So just to give you a little bit of background, there's been several studies to understand resources needs in the last decades. There's been compilations and overview of available resources and instruments, some of them relatively new, released this year by the OECD. Also, there's been statistical models that look into understanding resources by country and not necessarily by flows. And also, there's been top-down, as you know, analysis per IT target, like the high-level panels in 2012 and 2014. In all these analyses, what we've seen is that resources needed have fluctuated between $25 billion and $150 billion, and even higher for the high-level panel in 2012. But now there's more work in progress than ever before. We are looking at reports that look into benefits and costs from expand protected areas to 30% by 2030. We are looking at analysis on the economic impact from ecosystem services, from land use change, and we are looking at global assessment of resources needed based on focal activities. All these analyses are doing it right now because of we've seen how much resources are allocated for expenditures that harm biodiversity and not necessary to conserving it. So let me tell you a bit about the overview of the report. The report is basically divided in 3 parts. The first one reviews the latest analysis developed and benefits arising from biodiversity conservation effort. We center our attention in two analyses. One is the WWF Global Futures Report that is based on ecosystem services. And then we center analysis in a report that was led by Anthony Waldron, that it just was released a couple of weeks ago, that is based on expansion of protected areas. The second part of our report overview and advanced or completed analysis that are currently available on resource mobilization. Specifically, we look at 2 reports, also one conducted by Anthony Waldron and the TNC and Paulson's Institute report. And to complement these two areas, we also conduct our own statistical models, and we also conduct trying to predict the resource mobilization based on information reported by the CBD Financial Report Framework. I just want to mention that in all these reports that you will read in all the analysis that you will read in the reports, there's like differences in methodologies from all the analysis, and these are basically because how they manage the concept of relevant cost, especially between financial cost and opportunity cost. There's also differences in concept of what constitutes biodiversity relevant expenditure or investment. And for example, how much we want to invest in biodiversity. And also looking into, also looking into like different concept of finance. And so what are the main findings of this second report? First of all, that we see that the current estimates of biodiversity funding are around 78, like Jeremy mentioned, 78 to 91 billion. And we see that the global aggregate annual needs for all activities is much higher, between 7 to 10 times these current estimated levels. If we try to be more conservative, we still see that global financial needs using the NBSAPs and the data reported by the CBD still is between 150 and 300 billions. That's between 2 to 4 times current level. And if we look at more specifically at expanding protected areas, we see that still compared to current levels, the funding needs is around 4 to 7 times. The important thing about this is that if we implement an ambitious global framework for biodiversity, the gains, and this means that basically we are not losing in economic terms, not for biodiversity, just economics, between $500 and $500 billion per year. So what are the main messages from this report? The first one is that there are significant global economic costs from not investing enough in biodiversity conservation. Especially, we see that developing countries will bear the largest share of this cost. These resources, we need more resources, and these resources fluctuate between 103 to 895 billion. That's a big range, but of course that depends on what are we talking about in terms of biodiversity conservation. When we look in terms of percentage of global GDP, we are talking about between 0.1% and 0.7% of GDP. And of course, so far what we've seen in all the reports is that the return on investment on any dollar that we put into biodiversity conservation is extremely high. But we also need more data, especially we need more national biodiversity financial plans, data that they provide us to have more accurate assessments of resource mobilization and its benefits. Being a little bit more specific, we see a compelling economic argument to allocate more resources for protected areas, not only because of the generation of biodiversity as a whole, but as a
Excuse me, Mr. Pfefferholt, to interrupt, but could you please slow down a little?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. So specifically, we see compelling economic arguments to allocate more resources for protected areas. When the work has that study expansion of protected areas by 30%, the amount of resources needed for that expansion is between 5 and 7 times current expenditure. And what we see is that this expansion will generate annual gross revenues of between $100 and $300 billion, and that will give the fiscal burden of countries. We also see that doing more now will mean fewer financial resources needed in the future, especially if we implement a framework and we mobilize the resources needed. We think that financial resources needed will be substantially less than if the world remains on a business as usual trajectory. Not all regions reap the same benefits from increasing investment in conservation, nor do they incur the same opportunity cost. And what we see is that low-income countries have the highest potential to benefit and are thus the one most in need of investment. And finally, there's the need to concentrate efforts not only on mobilizing global resources from all sources, but also on the specific mechanisms. And here we think that exploring ways to enhance the impact of resources, it's important. And now I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna give the floor to Tracy to continue.
Thank you, Mr. Pfefferholt. I now wish to invite Ms. Cummings to present her report. If you could raise your hand. Yes, you also have 7 minutes. Ms. Cummings, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good day, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me, firstly?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Let me just... I'm sorry about this. There we go. It just takes a while for my power up. There we go. So I will be focusing on the third report, which has called the contribution of the panel of experts to the draft resource mobilization component of the post-2020 biodiversity framework as a follow-up to the current strategy for resource mobilization. It is quite a mouthful. The third report essentially provides a strategic approach to resource mobilization for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Effective resource mobilization will require transformative, inclusive, and equitable change across economies and across society. The approach we put forward is built around three interconnected components. The first is reduce or redirect resources causing harm to biodiversity. The second is generate additional resources from all sources to achieve the three objectives of the Convention. And the third is enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of resource use. Mainstreaming, which we note is an important thematic area of work, is an integral approach to all three of these components. It's a way of doing things. Finally, there are important leadership and collaborative roles for not just the public sector, but also the private sector and the finance sector. Focusing in on component 1, reduce or redirect resources causing harm to biodiversity, there are a number of recommended actions. All government budgets should have safeguards in place to result in at least no harm to biodiversity. The work around incentives remains incredibly important. We need to continue to work towards reducing harmful incentives, including subsidies. At the same time, we should be creating and scaling up incentives to encourage biodiversity positive behavior, such as tax breaks, and to discourage harmful behavior, such as fines and penalties. We should ensure that international development finance, for instance, for climate change or for the achievement of the SDGs, also results in at least no net harm to biodiversity. The finance sector should incorporate biodiversity impacts, dependencies, and risks into their work. We have set out some specific roles here for central banks, for development banks, for commercial banks and institutional investors, and the insurance sector, as well as governments, in order to achieve this. Similarly, business sector should integrate biodiversity into business models, operations, and practices. This will need supportive policy and regulatory frameworks from governments. Component 2 covers important actions for generating additional resources from all sources. There is a lead role to play for domestic public expenditure to provide a sustained flow of resources going forward. Increases in these resources can be through direct expenditure, in other words, funding aimed specifically for biodiversity, as well as indirect expenditure, such as through investments in regenerative agriculture. International development finance will remain crucial for resource mobilization, and once again, there is scope to increase both direct and indirect biodiversity-related finance. We need to see an increase in investment in biodiversity-positive projects in businesses and the finance sector. This will require support and leadership, not just from the private sector, but also from governments, development banks, and NGOs, such as through the provision of blended finance, among other things. Finally, we believe work can be done to enhance the implementation of agreements related to access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. Lastly, we move on to component 3, enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of resource use. This requires good governance and planning within the public sector. This could include NBSAPs that address the drivers of change, including economic drivers, the costing of NBSAPs, and the development of national biodiversity finance plans using biofin or similar methodology. We will need vertical and horizontal coordination within government and mainstreaming of biodiversity into sector and national development plans. This also includes recognizing and supporting community and private protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. We will need strong partnerships and platforms for policy coherence, for shared learning, and for the creation of joint approaches. We will need capacity building, technical assistance, and technological cooperation on a sustained basis for the public sector as well as businesses and the finance sector. The flow and uptake of international development finance should be improved, for example, through better coordination and through realistic timeframes for projects that seek to achieve transformational change. And finally, we should improve the monitoring and reporting processes for resource mobilization. This approach to resource mobilization, which we have put forward, a core element of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, is intended to provide a valuable starting point to collectively chart a path forward, to create just, transformative change, and to build resilient economic systems. From myself and the other two members of the panel of experts, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cummings. And my thanks to the expert panel for the excellent summary of their hard work. I now pass the floor to the Secretariat to explain the main document. So, Secretary, please raise your hand. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So, yeah, I'm pleased to provide just a few words on the main document, the document chapeau. Dear delegates, this document provides in section 2 more information on the mandate given to the panel of experts and the relevant activities undertaken to implement it. It then provides in section 3 updates on relevant activities being undertaken to implement the other elements of decision 14/22. And then it provides in section 4 elements of a draft recommendation for the subsidiary body for its consideration. So the results of the work of the expert panel are reflected in section 4 and the draft recommendation contained therein. In particular, and in close consultation with the expert panel, their contribution is suggested to be reflected in 2 elements, which are contained respectively in Annexes 1 and 2 of the draft recommendation. Annex 1 contains the experts' advice on elements on resource mobilization for possible inclusion directly in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework text. In the draft recommendation, it is proposed to invite the open-ended working group of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to take this Annex 1 into consideration. In order to provide additional operational guidance to these elements contained in Annex 1, Annex 2 distills the detailed considerations of the experts provided in the Add 3 document, which Tracy just summarized. It distills these detailed considerations into elements of a possible successor to the current strategy for resource mobilization. This successor could be adopted by the Conference of the Parties at its 15th meeting in its decision on resource mobilization, and suggested wording is included in the draft decision part of the draft recommendation. And finally, some elements of the experts' advice for instance, on the proposed future work on financial reporting, are directly included in the draft decision part of the draft recommendation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Before I open the floor for discussions, I would like to invite the Secretariat of the Global Environment Facility to brief us on plans for the GEF replenishment negotiations, which is relevant for our work on resource mobilization and the financial mechanism. Fonseca, please raise your hand. Mr. Fonseca, you have the floor and you have 4 minutes.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see my camera? Is that all good? Not yet.
But I can hear you.
Okay, let me see here. I guess it's working now.
Yes, now it's working.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for this opportunity. I'd like to thank the CBD for the opportunity for the GEF to address this important forum, albeit during difficult times for society, for biodiversity, and for the health of the planet. As you heard, the 2020 Living Planet report indicated that the global biodiversity trends continue to decline, and that COVID-19 is one very serious symptom of a progressively unhealthy planet. The IPBES report also reports that 1 million species are now on course towards extinction. But economists are increasingly taking note of the relationship between biodiversity loss and economic growth. The 2020 World Economic Forum Global Risk Report places biodiversity loss among the top 5 risks to society, to businesses, and to the economy in general. At the same time, biodiversity science is increasingly clear on what needs to be done to restore the balance between nature and human society. And this is the backdrop that the GEF, embracing its mandate as the financial mechanism of the Convention on Biological Diversity, will start to embark in the framing of the next set of funding strategies and in the negotiations for a successful replenishment of its trust fund for the GEF 8 cycle that will go from July of 2022 to June of 2026. The current cycle, GEF 7, is entering its 3rd year, and it's important to note that the biodiversity focal area enjoyed the largest financial support to date in the GEF 7 cycle, with funding being allocated to biodiversity projects and associated impact programs. These investments are systemically addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss and reflect GEF's evolution in supporting integrated solutions to conserve and to sustainably use biodiversity while providing benefits across all Rio conventions. We just heard from the CBD resource mobilization strategy draft, which identifies the importance of increasing ODA funding while also recognizing the need for mobilizing more domestic resources to successfully implement the CBD. We also heard that the private sector is a key player in this overall effort. So this is something that the GEF remains committed to supporting through investments in natural capital assessment and accounting, payment for ecosystem services, debt for nature swaps, project finance for permanence, blended finance, and other innovative mechanisms that can be deployed at the national level. To further facilitate this process, if guidance is specifically directed towards the GEF to support national financial plans to complement and be SAPs of recipient countries, we stand ready to provide support, particularly as we approach GEF 8 strategy. In December of this year, a decision will be put forth to the GEF Council that, if adopted, will initiate the process for the GEF 8 replenishment. We encourage all parties to work together to support a robust replenishment for JEF 8, which will be critical for the successful implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework to be agreed at COP15. It will also be essential to improve the health of the planet and to contribute to green recovery efforts that will be needed following the ongoing pandemic. With that, Madam Chair, I pass it on to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, GEF Secretariat. I would now like to move to our discussion. And to make the best use of our limited time, we now have around 20 minutes left of this session. And the technical possibilities we have, I first will open the floor for questions from regions. And I have requests from the following regions. Argentina will speak from the GRULAC region. I have a request of floor from Jyskans and from the EU and its member states. I encourage to keep your questions under 2 minutes if possible, and the panel of experts and all the secretariat will then answer. So I will start to give the floor to Argentina, making a regional statement from the GRULAC region. Argentina, please raise your flag. Argentina, you have the floor.
Also in English.
I'll make my statement in English. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
It is made on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. Dear colleagues, we're currently dealing with a sanitary, economic, and social crisis that will have severe consequences on the implementation of our environmental policies. This unprecedented situation is affecting our capacities and resources, and it calls for urgent action to address the 3 objectives of the Convention in a balanced manner, and in particular, it needs to be considered under the issue of resource mobilization. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the majority of the resources for the biodiversity have traditionally been provided by national governments. This contribution, which was a great effort during normal time, will become more difficult as we face the economic and social challenges from recovering from the pandemic. Therefore, GRULAC highlights that now more than ever, we require a decisive multilateral response that recognizes the vast financial needs for a sustainable recovery from COVID-19 and for implementing the post-2020 framework. The response should include ambitious commitments regarding resources, tools, and technologies for implementation, considering the principles enshrined in the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and those commitments should be an integral part of the new framework. The COVID-19 health crisis has further impacted the already burdened developing countries' efforts, and we know that national recovery packages on their own will not be enough to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. In this regard, we welcome the results and recommendation of the study on resource mobilization and look forward to a realistic and reliable commitment from countries and international donors to provide new, additional, and effective resources and to establish enabling tools and instruments to meet the incremental costs, technical needs of implementing the framework in developing countries in line with Article 20 of the Convention, with developed countries taking the lead. We also hope that JEF 8 incorporates all the guidelines of the post-2020 framework, and that in particular considers the investments that are required to meet our economic, social, and environmental challenges to build back better in the post-COVID period. Despite the efforts made to halt the loss of biodiversity, scientific data shows that the results are not encouraging enough, and there is need for enhanced action. Considering that resource mobilization requires also increasing private investment mechanisms, there is an opportunity for leveraging international platforms that boost cooperation and provide innovative solutions for raising awareness and capacities, and for increasing the understanding of biodiversity among different sectors. In these regards, we call to take extraordinary steps in order to achieve better outcomes. Finally, we urge all parties to adopt cooperative and constructive approach with a view to reaching an agreement in these matters, considering the different national circumstances and the limitations imposed by the pandemic. We reaffirm our commitment with this negotiation process, and in particular, we look forward to a resource mobilization strategy as an integral part of our post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Argentina, speaking on behalf of the GRULAC region. I will now give the floor to Germany, speaking on behalf of EU and its member states, followed by South Africa, speaking from the African region. Germany or European Union, you can raise your flag. European Union, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished colleagues, it is indeed my great honor to address this virtual meeting on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The EU and its member states thank the Secretariat and the SBI Chair for organizing this virtual meeting. And we thank the panel of experts for its reports, which will greatly help us collectively advance the process. We need transformative change, and that will not happen without mobilizing all types of resources, financial, human, technical, and institutional, from all sources, domestic, international, public, and private, in a balanced way and as part of a broader agenda to make our economic and development policies greener and sustainable. The EU and its member states very much agree with the expert panel that resource mobilization encompasses the generation of new resources, but also the reduction of resource needs through, for example, the reform of harmful subsidies and biodiversity-friendly solutions, as well as maximizing the impact of resource utilization through an efficient and effective use of resources. Resource mobilization also encompasses effectively mainstreaming biodiversity in all sectors, including the finance sector, and creating a more enabling environment through appropriate regulations and use of financial, economic, and sectoral instruments. We will also need to make sure that synergies between financing of biodiversity and financing of other sectors, in particular of climate, are maximized by equally considering biodiversity objectives and other environmental objectives. This approach will be crucial if we wish to align public and private financial flows with biodiversity objectives as the main way of scaling up resource mobilization and better meeting the needs of nature and people as part of a truly transformative change. In this regard, we have to consider also the principles of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. It will also help us to build back better, address the root causes of pandemics of zoonotic origin, and achieve a green economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, which is aligned with environmental, in particular biodiversity, and climate objectives. This will also support to accomplish our commitments to SDGs. The EU and its member states would have a few questions to share in order to make sure that we are all clear on the next steps of the process. First of all, on substance, we note that the expert panel proposes to establish a nationally determined target for domestic resource mobilization. Domestic resource mobilization has a broad scope and entails different elements such as fiscal reforms, subsidies, and other incentives, involvement of the private sector and other actors in society. So what could be quality criteria that could serve as a common benchmark to define these targets? Our second question is the following. Could the panel provide explanation on what is meant by country-to-country access and benefit-sharing agreements, which are suggested as an element to generate additional resources? And then our third question relates to synergies between financing of biodiversity and other financing, such as climate, which are a possible solution to generate more resources. In this sense, what will be the best reporting and monitoring processes to avoid overlapping and duplication? And then we have a final question on the process. Where will the discussion on monitoring elements and indicators regarding resource mobilization take place? Will that be at SAPSTA or SBI or both? Distinguished SBI Chair, let me assure you that the European Union and its member states stand ready and committed to engage constructively with parties in order to develop and implement an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework, including its resource mobilization component. Thank you.
Thank you, European Union and its member state. I would now like to give the floor to South Africa, speaking on behalf of the African group, and then followed by Switzerland, speaking on behalf of the Jaskans group. South Africa, you have the floor.
I hope the chairperson can hear me. Thank you very much, Chair, and we really appreciate the work that was facilitated through Secretariat and also the panel as assigned. South Africa speaks on behalf of the Africa Group, and we take note of the outcomes of the report from the panel on resource mobilization. Africa considers resource mobilization as an integral part of the implementation of the Convention and critical in ensuring that the 2030 goals and targets are met. This matter is given credence in the text of the Convention, specifically Article 20 of the CBD, which highlights the obligations of developed countries in providing new and financial resources to enable developing countries to meet their obligations in this Convention. In consideration of the outcomes of the three reports presented before us, it is worth noting that the elements of the terms of reference for the panel of experts on resource mobilization have, amongst others, on paragraph 15E, required that the panel need to explore options and approaches for mobilizing and providing additional resources from all sources. In this regard, and in order for us to achieve the transformative change and the success of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework required by 2030, the Africa Group considered the establishment of a dedicated biodiversity fund to support effective implementation of the global framework. This was raised and supported by many parties during the open-ended working group, the second open-ended working group, as critical to be addressed by the panel. Examples on such dedicated funds can be drawn from the UNCCD Land Degradation Fund and the Global Climate Fund that support the UNFCCC's obligations, in addition to the GEF Fund. The proposal for a biodiversity fund can be explored as one of the options and approaches for mobilizing and providing additional resources from all sources. Article 20 of the Convention on Biological Diversity is central in meeting the Convention's three objectives: conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, and a fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. It is worth noting that the assessment done by the panel is more into providing scenarios to support the conservation efforts. The other two elements, being sustainable use and benefit sharing, need to be treated in the same if biodiversity is to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals too. The recommendations provided in the three reports put a lot of obligations on governments to redirect funds from the fiscus or from their fiscus to finance the implementation of the framework. This must be understood in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic as an additional pressure, which forced most developing countries in particular, the governments in developing countries, to redirect their resources to respond to the effects of this pandemic, which brought so much burden to our health systems and affected food security, affected jobs, and negatively affected the economies of developing countries. Lastly, the absence of a time-bound action plan for resource mobilization will have negative impact on the implementation of the framework. This is an issue that we need to address. As a region, the African continent stands ready to contribute to a new paradigm, in particular the discussion on means of implementation for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, South Africa. I will now give the floor to Switzerland on behalf of a Jaskans group, followed by China. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Switzerland would like to make a brief statement on behalf of the following countries within the Jaskans group: Australia, Canada, Iceland, Israel, Monaco, New Zealand, and Switzerland. We would like to express our appreciation to the panel of experts for their very detailed and thorough work. We have read the 3 reports with great interest and appreciate the high level of detail, expertise, and fact-based assessments. Resource mobilization is key for the implementation of the goals of the CBD and its protocols. The 3 reports clearly show that a lot has already been done, but there is still work to do. It is clear that all parties will need to work collectively to significantly increase the mobilization of resources from public and private sources. We will need a wide variety of channels and financial instruments to address the various demands and to work most effectively and efficiently. For this, we can also learn a lot from the UNDP BioFin initiative and countries' experiences on the implementation of concrete financial plans. The panel of experts also clearly showed that we will have to significantly reduce harmful incentives for biodiversity. Today, a significantly higher amount of public finances are spent on activities that are harmful for biodiversity than for the implementation of the Aichi targets. We have to change this and work across our governments and the private sector to ensure policy coherence and to reduce biodiversity harmful incentives in a stepwise approach. As highlighted by the panel of experts, increased engagement and collaboration with the private sector, and in particular the financial sector, will be essential to the successful implementation of the Convention and its protocols, and we couldn't agree more. We should aim high in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and we should inspire ourselves by studying the interesting work of the financial sector, which has been triggered by the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. Ultimately, we should aim to collectively make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards a biodiversity net positive development, ensuring an increased resilience of nature and people. We also fully agree that there is the need to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of our interventions. As parties, we will have to collectively assess how we can further increase the effectiveness and efficiency of our actions domestically and internationally, to ensure that we generate the highest possible impact on the ground with our interventions, and that our support is implemented through a wide partnership in a fully transparent and accountable manner. Thank you, and we are looking forward to a fruitful discussion with all of you on this very important topic.
Thank you, Switzerland. Dear colleagues, time is running. I'm very sorry for that. And I would like to express my thanks to the interpreters that still is with us, but just for a very short while. So I will give the floor to China. And after that, I need to close the list. I'm very sorry for that. because I need to give back the floor to the expert to respond. But China, you have the floor.
We'd like to thank the three experts for their presentation, GEF and Secretariat. We have two questions. First, we noticed that in the Rome meeting of WG 2022, number of countries mentioned increase of X% in the framework will not be determined until the expert group's work is completed. So we'd like to know what are their basic considerations on the X percentage. Second question is, the Aichi target has expired. We need to have a new resource mobilization strategy, mobilizing all sorts of channels of financing from international. We need to be clear about the resource mobilization targets for all kinds of channels, so as to set up the long-term mechanism for evaluating the effective use of the resources. So we'd like to know from the Secretariat or the experts on their consideration in the new resource mobilization strategy.
We now return to the panel of experts to respond to some of the questions, and I will start to ask Ms. Tracy Cummings to respond. You have 10 minutes, and then we need to conclude the meeting. So please go ahead, Ms. Cummings.
Very much, and thank you for all the questions and for the input from the regions and the other parties. So I'm going to start with 3 of the questions that were sent through from the EU. I do want to mention some of these questions are quite specific, and some of them go beyond the core scope of the 3-panel reports. So we did think about these things, but we didn't spend months contemplating these things. So I'll answer as much as I can. On the first question, which looks at the nationally determined target for domestic resource mobilization and the various aspects of that, I first want to clarify, I think when we spoke about a target for domestic resources, that was specifically around resource flows. It wasn't about fiscal policies and strategies. We think that needs to be dealt with separately. Looking at specific flows, we feel that for both domestic and for international sources, the focus should not be on just wildly increasing funding, but on funding flows that meet the need, so that our languages are commensurate with the ambition, which means, and this also answers China's first question, we don't have a number because the targets haven't been set, and the number of how much funding flows need to be set aside and set as a target to meet these can't be determined until the parties commit to all the other activities that need to happen. Attached to this, though, and I think Yasser kind of referred to this a bit, is if we work on reducing the negative impact on biodiversity, then the actual funding flow that is needed to improve outcomes for biodiversity will be less. So if we fix our subsidies, we'll need to spend less on restoring biodiversity, for example. Then this question also mentioned targets around fiscal incentives, subsidies, that sort of thing, private sector actors. And here I'm dealing with this slightly differently. we feel that targets on this are more likely to be input-driven rather than outcomes, unfortunately. And that's because the work that can be done is changing legislation and changing policies that are intended for biodiversity positive outcomes. And that might be the only thing we can effectively measure in multiple countries. Moving to the second question from the EU on could the panel please provide explanation on what is meant by country-to-country access and benefit sharing agreements, which are suggested as an element to generate additional resources. We put this forward as a suggestion of a possible approach that might help generate additional resources from biodiversity. The language country to country was used to keep it as open as possible, so not just to focus on business to business or business to country, and to suggest that it is something that could be worth exploring further by parties in conjunction with the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol Secretariat. We did not specifically examine this issue in detail, and we do not have more specific proposals on this regard at present. We do feel that it is important to look at. The final question that I'll answer from the EU is on synergies between financing of biodiversity and other financing, such as for climate, and possible approaches for reporting and monitoring. I first want to take a step back. I think there is real value in commitments for a percentage of, for instance, climate change funding to be allocated to nature-based solutions, something that I am aware the AFD has recently done. When you have commitments like that, you can then report and monitor those commitments. I think we should have strong synergy between the UN Secretariat and that we should look for collaboration between the GEF and the GCF. And I also think there should be a clear and transparent process for biodiversity tagging in other funding flows that all countries can use and that all countries agree on. I think I've answered the 3 EU questions. The China question, I think I've answered theirs when I answered the first EU question on how we're not setting a monetary target yet. I'm afraid the second question from China, I didn't actually get from the
Yes, Tracy, I think I think that we answer some of the questions could they be written in writing after the session. But before we conclude, I would like to give the floor to the Secretariat again for some responses as well. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Excellent. No, just to provide perhaps some element of an answer to the last EU question on the process, where the discussion specifically on the indicator and indicators and monitoring elements for resource mobilization would take place. Of course, these resource mobilization indicators are now included in the monitoring, in the draft monitoring framework, which will be considered. And SBI has the overall responsibility to develop a comprehensive and coherent monitoring framework addressing all the goals and targets. So from that perspective, it would be useful if that overall responsibility would be kept intact, and that then of course includes also the indicators on resource mobilization. Now, of course, we need to recognize that looking at the past experience, the let's call it resource mobilization community that assembles in the contract group on the financial mechanism and on resource mobilization really has a specific expertise. So from that perspective, we can also foresee, as we move along, to have some form of iterative process where some issues, as the needs arise or is identified by SBI, could be perhaps taken more in depth in the contract group, either at SBI or at the COP. Now, of course, I mean that assumes that we are going to have a contract group, which again, I believe, looking at past experiences, is extremely likely. With that, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Distinguished delegates, I'm sorry, but we don't have the time to take additional questions. And as I said before, answers to the questions in the chat will be provided in writing after the session. And we can also all look forward to a discussion that we will have at SBI-3 on this subject. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our session. Thank you all for your participation today. I would like to thank the Secretariat, the interpreters, the report writers, and also the platform administrators that has helped us with this new virtual session. The special virtual session of SBI is now closed.